We've talked about controlling the agenda. We've talked about the ideas for policy solutions and where those come from. Now we're really moving on through the process here. We're at the stage of policy creation. So, how does the policy actually get created, passed, and made? And here we have President Obama signing a bill into law. This is several members of Congress behind him. So, they've passed the law. Now the law is on the president's desk, and he is signing the bill into law. The policy creation step means that the institutions in the government are translating those ideas, those solutions from policy formulation. So we're taking those ideas and we're turning those into actual policies. Now we've been through this with all four of the branches that we've dealt with. So we're not going to get into a ton of detail here, but each of those policymaking institutions has their own process for creating or changing policies. So like Congress has a very complicated process, a different one in the House and in the Senate. It goes through several committees and conference committees before it gets to the president's desk. That's Congress turning a bill into law. The president can pressure Congress to pass laws that they like. The president can issue executive orders or come to executive agreements with other countries. The bureaucracy, remember we talked about the bureaucracy, they have rulemaking powers. So they create regulations that create the details of the law. And then the courts, even the courts have policy making powers when they make decisions that create new precedent or change policies. They may overturn laws and things like that. And that changes policies as well. So the policy creation, this is where the policy making institutions, this is done by the branches of government. And this is where we see them translating those ideas into actual policy. So in our picture here, we have Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi and Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer passing the American Rescue Plan. So translating ideas about how to boost the economy because after the coronavirus pandemic is slowing, how to boost the economy, and they've created a package of laws and programs to try to do that. So who is it that actually creates the policy? This is our branches. So Congress, President, courts, right? Let's not forget the bureaucracy, but Congress passes the bills into law, sends them to the president to get approved. The president signs bills. The president creates executive orders, executive agreements. The bureaucracy, the federal bureaucracy is able to use rulemaking powers, policy making discretion, and the courts, they make decisions that change public policy. Okay, now the policy has been created. The policy is passed by the government. It's time to translate that policy into real action. So we go to our fourth stage here, which is policy implementation. So what we see in the background there, we see a hardworking TSA agent actually enforcing the policies of the government. So that's what we're going to talk about here is turning those policy ideas into reality. So when we talk about policy implementation, it's the executive branch, and really we mean the bureaucracy. The federal bureaucracy is responsible for all of the steps that come between the announcement of the policy and you actually feeling the consequences there. So there may be minor changes in the policy, and like in the implementation from the bureaucratic agencies. They may decide like this is, these are the best detailed ways to solve that problem. Think of the TSA agent there. TSA constantly making little details of the law to make planes safer. Or what we have in the picture here, a great example of policy implementation has been the national government organizing vaccine distribution across the country. So we have several agencies working on that together, starting from a place where the government announces that vaccines will be available and gives the states advice on how to distribute those vaccines to the public. And then all those agencies working together to actually build vaccination sites, get the information out to the people, and put shots in the arms. Here's our easiest one. Who implements the policy? So when we're trying to find out which branches or which groups, institutions are in charge of policy implementation, it's easy. It's the bureaucracy every time. It is always the federal bureaucracy that is putting the policy into action. All right, now the policy is passed. The effects are felt by the public, and it seems like we ought to be done, but we're actually at our last step in the policymaking process, which is a lot like the first step here. We're at policy evaluation. So here we see, a member of the public thinks that Obamacare sucks, and so he's out there advocating for a change in policy. This is part of the last step in our process that we call evaluating the policies. All right, once that policy is in effect, it's time for policy evaluation. It's time for all of these different actors that we've talked about to decide if this is good policy or bad policy. So we have formal ways to evaluate the policy, like judicial review, like this goes before a court, and the court says, actually, this plan is unconstitutional. You can't even do that. That's illegal. Or we have informal ways of evaluating the policy, which is just, people complaining or protesting or people, uh, tweeting, writing to the newspaper, talking on the news, things like that. These are all forms of policy evaluation. So this is the last step in our process. We're trying to figure out, did this policy work the way we wanted to or not? And even though it's the last step of the process, it's identical to the first step in the process, right? This is a major part of agenda control. Part of setting the agenda is figuring out which policies suck and which ones need to change. And so, even though like the way we're going through them today is kind of a 5-step list, it's really more of a cycle, an ongoing cycle. Once you get to policy evaluation, you are right back at the beginning of the cycle again, because policy evaluation is just another form of agenda control. So here in our picture here, we see an interview on the news, and we see a member of the bureaucracy talking to the media about how the states need to keep the schools open. So that's an example of they're just spreading a message that closing the schools was a bad policy. And so this is kind of what we see as an informal venue of policy evaluation. All right, so when we try to figure out who is responsible for policy evaluation, you'll notice, just like we said, evaluation is just like agenda control. The same exact groups are responsible for policy evaluation. So the media, like in the picture here, the media gives us information about the success or failure of policies. Interest groups may be trying to influence policymakers to get rid of existing policies or to add new policies. Political parties usually evaluate the policy. Mostly political parties will just decide that if the other party passed it, it's a bad policy, and if they pass it, it's a good policy, but that's still policy evaluation. Congress will evaluate the policy through their oversight process of the bureaucracy, make sure this policy isn't wasteful, make sure that this policy is working appropriately. The president evaluates the bureaucratic agencies, evaluates the commissions, does the studies of policies and things like that. So the president and their administration is always evaluating policy. The courts, every time they're using judicial review, they're evaluating policy of a different part of the government. And the public, every time we're talking politics in class, every time we're talking about the way things are, we're doing a form of policy evaluation. Just simple expression of happiness or displeasure with existing policy is a form of policy evaluation where we are deciding if this policy works or not. All right, and that brings us to our boy, President Trump. Here he is doing a little evaluation of the British Guard here. So hanging out in UK and checking out the troops that guard the royal family there. This was a really short and easy one. This is all pretty vague, but we're just going to be expected to always be able to talk about how different institutions control the agenda. We want to always be able to describe the institutions that create the policy. We want to be able to describe the institutions that implement the policy. That one's always the bureaucracy. And we want to be able to talk about the different ways different groups evaluate the policy. That's basically the same as controlling the agenda. So let's remember this policy making process as a cycle. We didn't get into a ton of details today because this is all pretty much a review of what we've done as we've studied each of the branches. All right, that's a quick run through of the policy making process. Now that we have reviewed and we are totally set on the steps in the policy making process, we're going to look at different areas of policy, and we want to always be looking at what liberals and what conservatives think about these types of policies.